In 2015, an engineer said to me while I was in London that BIM was the best thing to happen to his industry, and that the UK government's BIM programme was the best thing that the government had done for the industry, with the exception of health and safety. So the question we'll start with is, why are governments getting involved in the introduction of BIM? Why is it a strategic issue for governments and industry alike? And the second question we'll look at is what is happening around the world in different countries, from Europe, UK, Europe, Latin America and Asia. What are the consistent things which we see across those different countries at a national programme level? And thirdly, how is it being put into practice? How are these policies and BIM programmes being developed, and what does the roadmap look like of these programmes over a couple of years? Well, first of all, my name is Adam Matthews. I am the head of the Centre for Digital Built Britain's international programme here in the UK. I would like to thank first of all BIM FORUM ARGENTINA, IATASA and Embajada Británica in Argentina for the kind invitation to speak with you during this webinar. What I'm going to do is just talk through each of those three questions. First of all, why are governments getting involved with BIM? What is happening? What do those national programs look like? And thirdly, how are they being developed? How do they get organised? What do those roadmaps look like over multiple years? To do that, I'm going to refer to a couple of different models and ideas and consistent principles that we see from the work that we've been doing here at the Centre with countries across Europe, Latin America and Asia. Countries as diverse as UK and Vietnam, Chile, Brazil, Colombia. I could go on, but we've worked with central policymakers, public procurers and the industries of those countries for some time now. And what's been really key to me is starting with the end in mind. So we're going to start there. Why are governments doing this? What is the benefit that they perceive, and what is it that they see as the outcome? So we're going to start off with that why question. So first of all, we recognise that in the industry, the construction sector as a whole is an incredibly large industry. It's an incredibly important industry. It's different estimates place it at being valued at $2.5 trillion to $4 trillion. It employs a huge number of people. Just in Europe, it employs around 18 million people. Here in the UK, we employ around a number of about 300,000 organisations are employed by the sector. So it's an incredibly important part of the economy in itself. The important thing that we'd like to look at in this question of why governments get involved is because also it plays a very important role in the whole economy. And by that we mean that it produces the infrastructure, the schools, the hospitals, the road system, the communication system and so on that a country depends upon for its economic activity and socio-economic activity. So clearly it's a very important sector. What's been noted in a number of reports is that it's not the most productive. Its productivity is flat or falling in a number of countries over the past number of decades. We see here on the slides references from McKinsey, World Economic Forum and various others that highlight that falling productivity and low productivity. But also its low use of digital is also called out by a number of reports, academic reports as well as government-led reports, industry reports. So its low digitalisation also suggests that it hasn't taken full advantage of of how digital technology, standards and work practices can make in terms of improving decision making, and by improving decision making, improving productivity and improving the quality of decisions, which in turn reduces waste and improves value for money. So this is the first idea, or the first reason why governments get involved, is because the opportunity of the construction sector is so large in terms of getting better value for money, better value for public money, of course, importantly, and also its low use of digital indicates that there's an opportunity there. If we can make it more digital, more digitally aware and digitally skilled, that will improve its performance, and that will then allow us to get better value for money from the sector. The evidence from the UK would suggest that this has had a very positive effect over the past 6-7 years of the programme, of the UK government's BIM programme, which was really trying to progressively encourage the use of digital and digital information into the sector. And by doing so, it believes it's contributed to savings of around $3.7 billion worth of savings over the last 3 years of the UK government's construction strategy in 2011. So the evidence is indicated at a national level that this is having an impact, but we also know from a project level that when we introduce BIM, that it also has a positive effect at the project level as well in terms of efficiencies. There are a number of reports, and there's a report being developed right now by the UK programme with the Centre for Digital Built Britain, which is being produced by PwC, the consultancy, to look into the benefits of BIM at a project and organisation level, and that will be made public later in the year. So just to look at some of the evidence that we see around Europe, this survey was conducted in 2016 of the European national BIM programmes. And what we can see here is this economic factor is a very important reason why governments have decided to take a proactive role in encouraging the use of building information modelling. What we see on the survey is that a number of the BIM programmes had started because governments wanted to identify economic savings within the capital phase, that is to say the delivery phase of the construction project. And other BIM programmes have been started because they wanted to see an improvement to the value for money that was being gained during the operational phase, that's to say the whole life phase of that particular infrastructure asset or social infrastructure asset. So this is a consistent factor with a number of the BIM programmes, but it's important also to recognise that while the economic factors were primarily called out as the reasons for government programmes, there were other reasons as well. Some social reasons and environmental reasons. Environmental reasons primarily were to secure an improvement for protection of the environment, so a better understanding of the use of energy, for instance, but also from a social perspective, the introduction of digital skills was also recognised as a reason why governments had started up their national BIM programmes. So what does this mean for Argentina? Now this is a tool that I'm sharing here on the screen, which might be a useful starting point. It's one of the areas that we start when working with other countries, is to begin with the outcome in mind. And the idea here is that the country begins by looking at what are some of the national priorities, what are some of the national challenges and opportunities that are looking to be addressed. And that's obviously a whole range of different things. So that's narrowed down by the second lens, which is the idea of government priorities in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And these are usually accompanied by a policy. So that's the second lens that we look through. and we overlap those, and then we overlap the third lens, which is what can BIM do to help those two aspects of the national priorities and objectives, the government policies combined. How can BIM contribute to that area? So this might be the first thing that Argentina could do. And I'll pause there, and I would look forward to any questions that you might have and interacting with you during this webinar. So to the second question then that we set out at the beginning, what are the common factors, what are the common ideas and principles that governments and national programs to encourage BIM all have? When I start this, I think about an architect who I met and worked with in London a couple of years ago, said that when they introduced BIM to their practice, they saw a productivity improvement, as you would expect. They invested some money in training and in the development of their own working practices, hardware and the technology as well, of course. And they expected to see a return for that investment, and they did. They saw an increase in productivity, profitability as a result. They also said that they expected that profitability and productivity to go down when the UK government encouraged and introduced and developed a single national definition for BIM in 2014. They thought that it would go down because they would be having to comply with an external standard, and it would become a compliance activity that would slow down their internal activities and working with other companies. So they were expected to see a profitability drop and productivity slow down as well. They saw the opposite. A couple of years after that introduction of the UK BIM standard, which became the ISO 19650, they saw profitability and productivity take another jump up after the introduction of a national standard, and they looked at why that was. And the main reason was because they then felt that on going to a project, each time they go to a new project, they would have the same language, they would have the same concepts, they would have the same terminology and expectations of each other, of the other different actors around the table. That's to say the client, the project manager, the other designers, engineers, and the contractor would all have a consistent language and all come from this perspective of BIM as a methodology and not as a technology. And that was incredibly powerful, had a real effect on their profitability, and it was something they weren't expecting. So we're going to start by talking about what is it then that goes into a national program. What are the core components? We're going to use this model here that we've developed as a result of working with dozens of countries around the world and the consistent things that we see in those different national programs. And it comes down to these four different strategic pillars. This is looking at the resources and capabilities that each country develops in these four distinct areas. The first of them is about public leadership, the second about communication and community building, and the third is around the development of documentation, the development of a framework and common definitions, and finally the fourth one is about building capacity. We do these three elements that I mentioned first of all to develop capacity and to grow capacity of both the client community, the public client community, and also the private sector industry, architects, engineers, contractors, and everybody else in the construction sector. First of all, this is not a linear model in the sense that there's one individual or one group of actors that develop one of these areas of strategic strength in a particular direction in one go. This is very much an iterative idea, so some developments on the communication side, some developments on the standards development, the framework development, may be accompanied at the same time by some developments at the public leadership level. So this is very much progressive and iterative, and it's also a joint activity. No one individual actor or group of actors will conduct one of these particular areas on their own. In the next question, we'll also look at how it comes together and what are the different roles. But for now, what we're going to talk about is what do these 4 areas look like in practice. And then we'll talk about what does it possibly mean for Argentina. So the first one we'll talk about at the bottom is about public leadership. Public leadership is where we left the first question about why. Why are we doing this program, and what would be the expectations and outcomes and benefits for government and for the industry to partake jointly in a combined national BIM program. So the leadership idea begins with understanding why government are doing it, what is the vision, what are the challenges that they look to overcome, what are the barriers potentially that will need to be overcome as well. It's about developing a long-term strategy, and it's about developing a commitment within government and combined working with industry as well to develop that industry. It's about creating a case, and when we mean a case, we mean a rationale. That could be a business case. It could be the rationale for why it should be introduced into public policy, for instance. One example, like the UK example, was that we wanted to see better value for money. Quite simply, it was a period of public austerity, and the government wanted to look at ways to improve the efficiency of spending across all sectors, and in particular construction was seen as a sector where the value for money could be significantly improved. So it set itself the target in 2011-2012 to improve the value for money within the construction sector, public spending on construction, by 10 to 15%, and it achieved that goal by the end of that 5-year period during 2016. And it has since continued the programme as well, with much more ambitious goals running out to 2025. And those goals include improving the time to deliver projects, the efficiency of spending, the reduction of carbon, and also the improvement of trade with other countries. So understanding the role and the purpose for the programme is the first thing, which again we touched upon in the previous discussion. The second half of this area around public leadership is also to get an idea of how you will do this, and we'll talk about the how, the roadmap, in the next question. We're talking about a roadmap as well. One of the important things around this public leadership piece is the importance of dedicated resources, dedicated team of people to help drive this. And we've seen that in countries that have been successful with this program is the benefit of having a small funded team to help develop the framework and to encourage the adoption of this approach, this digital approach across public procurement. The second and third aspects of this diamond, this model, are the communications and community building and development of standards, the framework development as we call it. On the encouragement of communication, it's so important that different communities come together, because this is a whole sector transformation. That communication was one of the most important factors, I would say, in the UK programme and other programmes that I've seen, such as Chile's programme, which I think is a great example of this, is having a lot of engagement with industry, with academia, and with public procurers as well, all the way through the process, helps to encourage this and introduce this in a way that addresses the barriers that different communities will have. The third aspect of the model is around the creation of a collaborative framework. Now, what we mean by this is a set of guidances, standards, tools, legal documentation that is integrated, that creates this clear definition of BIM as a methodology and not just as a technology. So that is a very important thing to have written down for the country, that is internal within the country, so it's meaningful and it's adapted to the cultural aspects and the ways of working of that construction sector, but that it's connected to international standards as well. And specifically here, the ISO is a great example. Now that we have this definition of BIM as a methodology from the ISO 19650, then that, having connection to that, different countries have done that, such as Chile again, and a number of countries across Europe and in Vietnam and others around the world in Asia have made a connection to the ISO as a way to having a common language, not just within the country, but with other countries as well. And that's important to encourage trade, the ability of trade based on common terms and definitions. Fourthly, and the reason we're doing all of this, is to drive an improvement in capacity. And what we mean by capacity is the use of digital in a way to improve the process of construction. So that's both encouraging its use within projects, within public procurement, so that then the public client is getting benefits, getting improved decision making, for instance, but also then through the use of digital within the supply chain, that the supply chain is improving itself and improving its working with others, and not just within its one project, not just within the organisation, but across all other organisations as well, because they have that common set of terms and definitions. So that's an idea and some common principles that we've seen working with a number of different countries around the world for the core elements that go into a BIM program. I think for Argentina, the reflection that I would take from this is to think about what those things look like from an Argentinian perspective. What are some of the reasons for the introduction of BIM in a procurement into public procurement? For instance, is it to improve the quality of infrastructure? Is it to get better value for money from the public funding aspect of public construction, or is it to do something else? So starting off with understanding why is a very important aspect, but I'll also highlight the development of a consistent national framework for BIM is a very powerful thing, and referencing the ISO, of course, is also helpful because it then connects the Argentine construction sector to other sectors around Latin America, and also other sectors around the world can work with Argentinian companies to alliance and partner on particular projects in Argentina, which then helps to improve the quality of those projects and improve the capacity of the sector as a whole. So I think understanding the standards and using potentially academic maturity assessments of the status of the industry to identify what some of those barriers are is a very helpful starting point, as well as identifying things to build from. So I look forward to your questions during this segment of the webinar. So to our third question then, how does this all come together? How do national BIM programs work progressively? They run for a number of years, of course, 3, 4, 5 years. The UK program ran for 5 years initially and has been extended subsequently to that as well. So these are big programs that involve a lot of people potentially, because you're affecting a whole industry. That's certainly your aim and intention. So this idea, this roadmap, this sunray diagram here just really describes at the top right hand corner what is the goal that you're trying to get to, which in this case is to try and develop a digital construction sector, one that sees an improvement to both the productivity of the sector, but also to the outcomes for public sector. So that could be things that we talked about earlier, the economic, social and environment impacts. That's where we're trying to get to, the top right corner, and you'll see that there are the 4 different streams of activities that we discussed in the diamond example in the previous question. And this is over a series of phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. That could be a year for phase 1, a year or 2 years for phase 2, and phase 3 could be a number of years in its development. Phase 1 is usually about the exploration phase. It's about defining what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, and getting to the point of identifying that BIM is actually a public policy issue and that there should be a public position on it, a public statement around the introduction of building information modelling. Phase 2 is about defining the plan for that, so it's going into more detail, it's working out the resources that are needed, it's working out an implementation plan, it's looking at some of the reports of how it can be introduced into the standards of that construction sector. So what might be the best way to develop standards for the construction sector that define BIM, looking at the references to the ISO, for instance. All of that work and thinking goes into phase 2. And phase 3 is really looking at making the shift from transitioning from pilot projects and developing activities to actually implementing and rolling out the introduction of BIM requirements into public procurement across a whole range of different types of infrastructure owners. So that could be buildings and linear infrastructure as well. So 3 phases, and we've got 4 different streams of activity, and we've got 1 single destination in the top right corner. So we're all set to go. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I would like to just give you a flavour for the sorts of things that happen, and bear in mind as well, as we discussed before, that this is certainly progressive and it's certainly a joint activity between government and industry and academia and standards bodies. This is certainly not any one single party doing it all. Having said that, some of the colours that are used here indicate where there is a preference or a leaning towards a particular group of actors. So blue indicates that the large proportion of activity is led by the public sector through that work stream there that is defined as public leadership activities, whereas the green is representing industry, where industry is leading on other areas of activity such as standards development at the bottom right corner, where we see the development of the framework, the standards, the legal documentation and so on that we talked about earlier. So to begin with, what we see as a common starting place is it could be that there's a lot of industry activity around standards. There could be a lot of networks of architects or engineers that are very much like BIM Forum, that are coming together and developing things and identifying that there is an opportunity for the public sector to take a role. And at some point, in the top right corner there, you see where we've got the public sector engagement activity with the private sector as well. At some point, those 2 sectors come together, and that's seen here places a communication activity. Then the public sector get involved and start to recognise that there is a value for BIM to public policy goals, the goals that we talked about earlier, of course. So improving quality of infrastructure, improving its timely delivery, reducing the cost of infrastructure by improving the decision making and reducing the waste. So at some point during that process, we come to one of the first key milestones, which is that there is a public sector owner, a sponsor, that sees value for this introduction as part of a public policy program, and that there's a national statement, a national public sector statement that sets out the introduction and need for an introduction, progressive introduction of BIM into public sector construction. One of the next milestones along that is then the development of an implementation plan. That usually involves bringing together industry with academia and standards bodies, with government advisors, policy advisors or public procurers, to understand, well, how will this work? What is our implementation plan? How are we going to progressively introduce this into different projects, while at the same time developing a standard definition, while at the same time testing that this works in our type of projects and that it has benefits, and communicating it at the same time to other parts of the industry, to ensure that this is a complete whole sector approach and not just for one particular group, such as contractors or just for architects, let's say, either. Then after a plan has been developed, a strategy is in place, the next thing is then to have a team to help drive this. And this is an important thing that I've seen, again, working with different countries, is that it's not the sort of thing that can be done by working part-time very easily, and that's the same for industry as it is for the government. It certainly does take some resources, not much in the scale of things. So the UK programme, to give an indication, cost about $1 million per year for 5 years. It was extended after that as well, and we had a very significant impact and benefit for that. $5 million in total is actually, in the scheme of things, from a construction spend, and for the opportunity that we're looking to achieve, is actually a very small investment. But that paid for a team of people to help run the programme, to help communicate with industry, to help develop the standards, and also to help build capacity with the public client as well. And by the way, that's also very similar as the model to Chile, who we've worked with since around 2016, who've got a small team of people that help do those sorts of things with industry and with the public clients as well. So the next milestone is then to start testing that, to developing pilot projects, to developing the standards, the framework, the collaborative BIM framework. You want to have a framework for your country that works for you. So you need to understand how some of the international standards, such as the ISO 19650 and others, can be adapted and introduced into Argentina. Thereafter, then taking these pilot projects and the learning from those pilot projects to feed into the final production of the common framework and standards is the next logical step. And progressively increasing capacity. It's a slow process. I know from personal experience in the UK and other countries that this isn't something which happens, in a year or 2 years even. It's been, I think, 6-7 years since the UK programme started, and it's still rolling out across different public sector client projects as well. So it's a progressive programme, and that's why it's shown as a multi-phase exercise. This is just a model. Every country is different, but it just gives some ideas of different roles and of that progressive nature of moving from public sector buy-in to this approach to then progressively rolling out through pilot projects, developing standards, and then finally to into all public client projects. In reflection, and for Argentina, and maybe we can have a discussion about this and some questions, is that I think this is something that will be a very useful exercise to bring different actors, different parts of industry together with the public sector. In Peru, for instance, we had a workshop with the policymakers within Peru, with academia, industry, standards bodies, technology providers, and so on. And we had over 65 people over a series of days in the early part of last year to help build this roadmap, this national roadmap plan, which is being developed in Peru. I look forward to the questions and to interacting with you during the next segment.